Early 2020 saw the world in the grip of a new strain of virus. It wasn't long before the UK was plunged into lockdown, and many businesses were forced to adapt quickly or risk closing their doors for good. Employees in their droves were forced to adjust to new norms. Many began working from home, juggling career responsibilities with home life and general uncertainty about the future. As well as being a transformative year for most businesses, with a sharp move to more digital and online products and services, COVID-19 has given more prevalence to age-old issues in business ethics, with many citing post-lockdown business recovery as a chance to rebuild more sustainably, more responsibly. Over lockdown periods, air pollution levels dropped as commutes to work and travel became rare, and some of the most polluted cities in the world were breathing cleaner air. In both the community and in workplaces, there was a heightened focus on and need to address well-being concerns. "How are you?" was no longer a throwaway greeting. Businesses across the UK had to change their profit-driven thinking to consider the well-being of their employees, customers, and society. In November 2020, the government announced a new 10-point Green Industrial Revolution plan, committing to a more responsible future, with pledges to invest in greener energy and decarbonisation, which sits alongside Lloyds Banking Group's Big Conversation initiative as a blueprint or greenprint to help Britain recover. It's time for a new business as usual. And as Britain's businesses recover, developing more responsible, sustainable practices has never been more crucial and more achievable.
I'm delighted to be chairing today's panel, Disruption for Good Post-COVID. How do we use this crisis to spark the change we need for business? Today, I'm delighted to welcome three experts in this area who are going to introduce themselves shortly with their opening question around why this agenda is important for them. Amanda, let me come to you first. If you could just introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit of why this agenda is important for you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me on the panel. So I'm Amanda Mckenzie, I'm the Chief Executive of Business in the Community, and I'm also a non-exec director of Lloyds Banking Group. Responsible business, I was a girl in the city, and I came out of the city to run the organisation that is dedicated to improving responsible business. So I suppose I would hope by definition that means it's my day job, it is my life, and I love it. I'm very lucky that I get paid, I suppose, to work in that intersection between how powerful and influential business can be, and especially when it thinks about its influence it can have and how intrinsic responsible business needs to be to it. So spending my days thinking about that is incredibly powerful. You know, sharing best practice, bringing business leaders together to learn together, be vulnerable together, and do wonderful things together. It's great. They actually pay me to do that.
That's wonderful, Amanda. And you pick up two really pertinent points that we don't often talk about. You know, one about vulnerability, and COVID-19 has shown us, you know, when we talk about responsible business, the vulnerability aspects of it, but also the challenges and the opportunities, which I want to come back to. But before I do that, Mark, let me come to you next. Would you just introduce yourselves? And the same question to you. Why is this agenda so important for you and the work that you do?
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My name's Mark Saunders. I'm Director of Global Engagement at the Business School and also Professor of Business Research Methods. For me, responsible business is about everybody's future. And it's about the future of the planet, but also about people. And probably from my perspective, the people aspect is really important. It's where my work is. I work with people, and I believe people are our future. And actually behaving responsibly is crucial to everybody's future. And not only that, the work which has been done on this area shows it also makes very good business sense as well.
Thanks, Mark. Again, really pertinent insights. You highlight that so much of the work that's often done around responsible business has been on sustainability and climate change. And yet we can't deliver on those agendas without people. And so you've emphasised the people aspect. And again, I want to come back to that in terms of how do we get people engaged? How do we use a process of disruption as a mechanism for enhancement? And finally, I'm delighted to welcome John Foster. Welcome, John, from the CBI. John, would you introduce yourself and tell us why this agenda is so important for you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Kieran. It's a delight to be with everyone here today. So my name's John Foster. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at the CBI. And look, why is this issue important to me? I've been at the CBI for 6 years now. And before I joined, I was one of these awful people that only ever worked in professional politics. So I did sort of 4 years as a special advisor in the coalition government, and I loved it. But what I saw in the day-to-day about business tended to be problems that had to be solved, interactions with government that were tricky. And then when I joined the CBI, I realized that business has just got such a fantastic story to tell. There are so many brilliant things that firms are doing. And one of the first engagements I ever had was actually with Amanda's company, the BITC. And it just opened my eyes to the power of business acting responsibly. And from that day forth, I've really sort of taken it as one of the areas of focus for myself in the business. So it's a real pleasure to be with everyone here today.
Great, thank you, John. And again, really powerful insight from each of you, how your personal passions also coalesce around the business needs. So the first question I want to pick up on, I want to explore 3 areas during our debate and discussion. I want to talk about policy and global impact. I want to talk about how business is changing on the ground and the implications of that as we move forward. And then I want to finish on, the development goals and responsible business's success for how academia and business work together to kind of achieve the ambition. So how do we put that research knowledge to work? So let me start with policy, because policy is so influential in helping us drive some of the change that we have on the ground. In terms of this wonderful phrase that's come out of COVID-19, build back better. But what does build back better mean in the context of responsible business and the way that we do responsible business in terms of the organisational challenges and the best practice that we have? John, let me come to you, because I know at the CBI conference, this was such an important theme this year. And, it advocated and articulated some really important insights. So what are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And what are some of the best practices that we should be, beginning to kind of think about and scaling up?
It's a really good question, Kieran. I think one of the reflections that I would have, so just a bit of backstory for people. So the CBI ever since 2017 have been running a twice-a-year survey called Everyone's Business. And the idea was trying to really understand what is the value, the relationship, the view of the public around how business interacts. And we've had some fascinating findings since then, most notably around the disconnect between business reality, the story that businesses tell, and then how much individuals and the public value firms. So just to give you an example, firms that people interact with on a day-to-day basis, banks and supermarkets, etc., people understand how they work. And as a result, they tend to value them. Businesses that are quite distant from our day-to-day lives, things like quarrying and mining, even some elements of professional services, people find difficult to unpack and understand. And as a result, they actually value them less. One of the things that we've seen during this particular COVID crisis is just almost a demystifying of business, because of those supply chains have been put to such brilliant use outside from what they would normally do. And actually, as a result, we've seen the public really appreciate what business is doing on a daily basis. So what I would reflect back, Kieran, is there are almost, I think, 4 ways in which business is trying to build back better and has been responding to this crisis. I think first and foremost, you have this overarching idea of what we at the CBI call business in the service of the nation. And it's something that I imagine Amanda might sort of see on a day-to-day basis. But this is the idea of business rolling up its sleeves, pitching behind a kind of national effort and doing brilliant things. And, you know, the obvious examples are the kind of ventilator challenge, the big push for hand sanitizer, all that kind of stuff. But actually the really important stuff around getting food on our shelves, our supermarkets have been spectacular in terms of service of the nation during this crisis. That's the kind of first and foremost. I think the second thing is this idea of business really supporting their employees. So one of the ways in which they can build back better is really cementing what I think we've seen during this crisis, which is excellent communications, really clear transparency, a big focus on safety, and huge amounts of flexibility. So our research has told us the number one driver of business reputation is how firms treat its staff. Now, by and large, firms I think have really doubled down on clear comms, making their teams feel supported, but also transparency around how we're going to kind of eventually, hopefully, get back to a normal. And then the final two areas are around business supporting customers and businesses supporting communities. And I do think when it comes to businesses supporting their customers, we've seen some brilliant ingenuity and flexibility. I'll give you an example. Hilton Hotel Group, working with Reckitt Benckiser, a brilliant pharmaceutical company based up in Hull, who have set up this kind of clean standard, working with each other as a partnership to make sure that their hotel rooms, for example, are brilliantly disinfected so that they can be safe, whether you're kind of coming back from quarantine or hopefully when we get to sort of see friends and family once again. So that kind of partnership working outside of sectors, I think, is something that hopefully we can really see. And then the final point, just to kind of the focus of this sort of conference, if you will, is business supporting the communities. And this will be sort of Amanda's pitch, so I don't want to stray too far in it. But again, I think we've seen some sort of brilliant examples of where business is generally trying to look after the most vulnerable, whether that be the efforts that we've seen around supporting homelessness, sort of food packaging, or even an example that was drawn to my attention of Boots working alongside EDF to get medicinal packages to people who are most vulnerable. So what I think we've seen is a real focus on what matters for people, which is how do you treat your staff, a real premium on making sure that their customers feel valued and safe. And then finally, just this, where can we go further in terms of looking after the most vulnerable in our society? That's what our kind of research has been telling us and playing back. But that's also what we're seeing in the ground with the discussions that we're having with our members.
John, thank you. That's really insightful. And I love the way that you're putting that research evidence to work. You know, I'm a great advocate. Research is only as good as what we do with it.
Absolutely.
And if we use the research as a process of disruption in order to create, you know, better communities, better business, you know, then that's a really good thing. Amanda, let me come to you, because I was really struck by what John said in three key areas. You know, he talked about people, he talked about customers, and he talked about communities. And if we're going to create responsible business, then what we can't do is work in one area and not the other. And I know that business in the community have an incredible reputation of bringing these three big areas together. So tell me a little bit more about the challenges and the opportunities in terms of policy change that you've been working on.
Thank you. And by the way, I love the notion of, well, not the notion, the in service of the nation. Genius phrase, but importantly, what lies behind it. Fantastic, just love it. Well, we with Birmingham Business School actually defined a couple of years ago now, we tried to put responsible business on one page, because I think what tends to happen is it can be a phrase that can mean loads and loads of things, or it's interpreted one particular way. And actually, if you want to drive action, you need to make it incredibly simple, and that somehow you can put it on a page and everyone goes, oh, I get it. It's you know, people, planet, and And I've just forgotten. Anyway,
Place.
basically, healthy. Thank you. Exactly that. And that interplay for us has always been healthy environment and healthy communities, and businesses' role. You can't have one without the other. And then off the back of that, we have a responsible business tracker, which is your own or your company's own health check. So off the back of that comes a measurement for you, and then you develop your own journey to making responsible business intrinsic. Because if you look at the journey of responsible business, and I always think back to, some Lever and Cadbury and the quite patriarchal responsible business folk of whenever it was, practically 200 years ago, it was very patriarchal. But I always loved this. Lever brothers had a clawback. They used to, Hesketh Lever used to give shares to his people, but he would claw them back if he felt that their behaviour was disreputable. Now, Ripple dissolve 150 years later. We invented that, about 10 years ago, it became a thing in the city. But how incredible that was there then. The seeds of it clearly interpreted for its time with all the surround sound that now we would think wrong, but amazing. But the difference was it was kind of on the side of the desk, it was programmatic, it wasn't intrinsic. So I think what's great about where responsible business is now, you could argue almost at a tipping point where, at last shareholder primacy doesn't seem to be the thing, thank God. It is stakeholders in the round, and it is more broadly. So you've got a kind of, what is responsible business? How do you measure it? It has to be absolutely the heart of your company. And then post-COVID, we did a piece of work. We obviously had to call it Build Back Responsibly. We couldn't say Build Back Better, naturally. And our 4 themes, which were business, they came out of business research as opposed to consumer. But I mean, clearly they have to be, not too far apart. Were 4, basically asking yourself 4 questions. What would it take for no one to be left behind, which is clearly your levelling up agenda. And you've got some, to give you an example, you've got examples of Direct Line now looking to open up call centres, definitely and nowhere near the south of England. So really thinking about that geographic levelling up issue there. We've done a ton of work in Blackpool, Wisbech. There's lots of case histories that you can have a look at. Second one was everyone being equal. What would it take? So clearly that's the inclusion agenda, of which, an awful lot is happening. We had, as of last week, 612 companies signed up to the Race at Work Charter. Phenomenal, really. What would it take for work to be good for you? So again, thinking about the mental health agenda, and actually how can you construct work that isn't a detriment to your mental health? I mean, clearly work versus no work is better. But then beyond that, what would it take? And it probably isn't quite such an enormous change as people might think it is. And then clearly sustainability being everyone's business. And I don't know about you, but I've really felt so pleased that over this last year, you could have argued people would have battened down the hatches and said, net zero, I'll deal with it when the pandemic's over. But they haven't actually. They seem to have stepped up their efforts to go, no, I'm not going to just go net zero by 2050, which was the initial hope. It's what will it take to do it by 2030? And then if I simply can't restructure my business significantly enough by then, be 2040. And then, of course, the complementary piece of this is the whole biodiversity agenda, which I think we're all too aware how, again, our net zero challenge is absolutely linked with the nature around us. And of course, that drives good mental health as well. So suddenly we're absolutely aware of how interrelated this all is. Sorry, I feel that was a long answer, but I hope that was useful.
It was a really powerful insight, Amanda. I love the way that you brought in concrete examples of the work that is being done, but also the opportunities that the future kind of brings for us. And 2 things that I want to pick up and come back to, because they're so vital and critical. We've talked about building responsible businesses, which I think is absolutely key, but in ways that look at issues around sustainability and net carbon zero. But you've also touched on 2 very important things that being a responsible business means is looking at the levelling up agenda. We know the inequalities that COVID-19 has highlighted on businesses. And you've also thrown a really important light about the work that you, your organisation and businesses are doing around race equality. And these are things that I want to come back to in a little bit, particularly around how the process of disruption has actually been a really thought-provoking process. And as you said, and rather than burying our heads and putting up, barriers, what it's done is opened new thinking and new innovation. So I'll come back to you about the levelling up agenda and inequality and different ways from home working to clean air, which I think, are really important, almost at different ends of the spectrum, but there is a meeting of them coming together. Mark, let me come to you, particularly with the people aspect of it. Talk to me a little bit about the work that you've been doing to kind of help inform, those future policy challenges and the global impact around responsible business, but putting people at the heart of the work that we do.
Oh, thank you. I was really pleased to hear both John and Amanda talk about people. I mean, and John saying business supporting employees. I think COVID as a disruption was a massive disruption because it actually said people have to work from home, which was for many people a massive change, but also for many organisations there was this, can we trust people to work from home and to do their jobs well? And what has actually happened, which for me is a phenomenal challenge, but an amazing thing, is we can. And people were forced to work at home. Businesses were forced to let people work from home wherever possible. And not only did they work from home, they worked from well in a completely trustworthy way. They innovated, they did things better in many cases, and they showed they could be trusted. So there's a really amazing positive coming out of that already. But at the same time, we have issues coming out of that in relation to people's mental health from being at home and not being able to work with others. So that to me is a sort of a twofold challenge coming from both ways. One is, do we want to ever go back to as we worked before? Because we hear in the news, we heard the chairman of Goldman Sachs rejecting home working last week. And this morning on Radio 4 on the Today programme, we heard of BP saying everybody's going to work from home at least 2 days a week. So what is this new normal going to work like? And what's it going to look like for different people in different organisations? Are there some jobs that have to have some connection in a face-to-face environment? And we're still coming to grips with that. So that's, I think, is a big challenge. But what, for me, is the most crucial thing is that we've actually now seen that it is possible to have reciprocal trust between employees and employers in a remote environment, and it can work in the short to medium term. What we're less certain about, though, is how does this work for when new people are recruited who've never actually met face-to-face? Also, we're still learning how to actually operate in a Zoom environment where people don't exist from here downwards. And where people's voices don't match their lip sync quite, and where there isn't that environment for that quick knock on somebody's door saying, "Oh, can you help me with this quickly?" How do we overcome those issues? So I think there's a lot of learning still to come through. But what we have seen is we've seen that people do have the abilities, skills, competence, characteristics to be able to work from home and to be managed from home, and for organisations to trust that. We've seen that people are integral and also have integrity, that they can be trusted. And what we've also seen, I think, which is something which organisations need to build on, and also in colleagues with each other, is in this ability to be benevolent, to have a genuine careness and concern for others in the workplace, and for that to be both ways. So I think there's lots of really exciting things coming forward, but we're still learning to operate in a very alien environment to most of us, and something which, in all honesty, we actually miss that face-to-face with real human beings. The ability to stick your head around and say, fancy a quick coffee to chat about this.
Great, thank you, Mark. You pick up three very insightful observations. You talk about trust, you talk about integrity, you talk about authenticity. But the tension and the paradox of that is when we talk about new normal, what will new normal look like for responsible business in the workplace? And I also want to come back to a really important point that you raised, Amanda, because you highlighted really carefully and thoughtfully the importance of measurement. How do we know what we are doing is making a difference? You know, we can measure zero carbon, you know, and in terms of, you know, what we are going to do. And we measure almost every other aspect of our business. So how do we measure how effective we are in the context of responsible business as we go forward? And I guess what I'm saying is, how do we move from good intention to good and responsible action? So Amanda, let me come back to you first, because you highlighted some of the things that you've been doing in the measurement space, you know, and then I'm going to come to you, John, in terms of, you know, other observations about new normal and how we begin to kind of not just measure outputs, but outcome and impact. Amanda.
Gosh, well, I mean, you're right. I think people being willing to measure things, it's quite interesting actually, because a couple of years ago, people were actually anxious to measure because people would go, I want to get better first. It's like an extraordinary thing. It's like, I always used to liken it to, and I speak from personal experience, I won't get on the scales today. I'll wait till I think I've lost a bit of weight, and then I'll shock myself just how much I need to do. So it's we've gone from that, whereas I think I'm encouraged, although there's a slight tendency to that. I think now we've got people going, no, let's face into this. And interestingly, things like the gender pay gap reporting and what we hope will come to pass in terms of ethnicity pay gap reporting, although an appropriate derivation of that. At first, everyone was very scared of what that would mean, but actually it's great because what it does is it prompts, as you say, Kieran, it prompts action and it prompts people shifting in the right way, and it prompts conversations that mean that when people look at the data, they're more challenging of it. So in a weird sort of way, it almost doesn't matter. I say this in inverted commas, what the data is, as long as it prompts the conversation and you are determined to get better off the back of it. Because that's what I always say to people. People often say to me, are there any members that you wouldn't have in membership? And I always feel that the employees of any company deserve a company that practices responsible business, even if you wouldn't necessarily say that the sector in itself is a tricky one. But also, if the sector has set itself a target to be more responsible in terms of its intrinsic product over time, then that feels to me, so a cigarette company that says, I'm going to go tobacco free by 2050, an oil company that says I'm going to be net zero to give you two examples, that's really positive. So it's data of the actual purpose of the company, quite apart from the specifics underneath that, against be it, you know, gender or race, or I think science-based targets are going to have a profound impact on how people measure themselves towards net zero. Ton of work in it, but very, very important. And then I suppose we've covered all of the issues. Mental health, of course, clearly it's something that you can ask employee surveys regularly. I think that's the other thing we've heard over this past year, people wanting to do pulse surveys more regularly than before, than the classic annual time. I think people want to feel heard. You know, I think some people actually want to do it monthly. I wonder about that. That's a whole other conversation, I reckon. But anyway, sorry, there's some thoughts.
Thank you. And they're really important thoughts. And I love the metaphor, you know, and some of the analogies that you've used, because why do we measure? It isn't just, you know, to kind of highlight that we are making a movement. Actually, there's a real demand from us now by our customers, by our communities, but also if we want to attract the kind of talent that we often talk about, people are voting with their feet. You know, they're choosing the kinds of organisations they want to be in. I'm struck by the next generation of future leaders who are asking some of those bold questions as part of the interview process. where is it on your website? You say that you are an equal opportunities employer. Show us what you actually kind of do. So I think you're absolutely right to say these are not easy things to be thinking about, when we are trying to build back better and we've got all of these competing priorities, and yet laying the foundations for responsible leadership, for me, seems so vital. And from the research, that I've been doing, that says if you get responsible leadership right and you get diverse leadership, then actually it helps bring some of the things that we've been just talking about in terms of building back more responsibly. John, let me come to you and ask for your, sort of kind of insights in terms of, the future and the things that we really have to be mindful of, but also the great work that we could be building on.
Yeah, I just, if it's okay, Kieran, I'll just build a little bit on what Amanda said, because it's just so much of it resonated. So, at the CBI, we work to the idea of what gets measured gets acted on. And to Amanda's point, it almost doesn't matter. It does, but it doesn't really. And I guess the sort of three areas that we're sort of looking at this is, so firstly, in the polling that I mentioned that we conduct, our Everyone's Business research, the metric that we've been using since 2007, we ask what the public think about business in general and their reputation. That goes up and down depending on external. What is really interesting is the metric we've allocated is what is the relationship between employees and employers. So the firm relationship with their staff. Do you think that the people you work for are good, basically? And we think that's a really good proxy for kind of where the state of the business reputation, business action, business desire to really take this forward is. And what we've seen is it moves up and down, but it's just started to tick up again over the COVID crisis, because people are seeing that the firms that they work for are doing really good stuff. They're going above and beyond. And to one of Amanda's points, and actually one that you made, Kieran, we asked the public how important, particularly for the under 35s, how important is it that your company has a purpose beyond a profit, that it contributes to something greater? And something like 70% said they feel more aligned, more committed to their company if they demonstrate value above and beyond making a profit. And the biggest driver is the environment. But in the kind of race for talent, this is so important. The second reflection I would just make is to Amanda's point about sort of gender pay reporting and now ethnicity pay reporting. If I think back to when I joined the CBI and the idea of ethnicity pay reporting was put on the table, you would have got people say, well, I mean, it's extra bureaucracy. This is going to cost us money. This is difficult to do. That's not the conversation you get now. The conversation you get now is, let's do it. Let's have a conversation about how we do it properly, but let's do it. And that is brilliant. And I would say the same with the kind of race to net zero. It's a difficult time for firms, but what you get is, I'm up for this. I'm going to need some support from the government. I'm going to need some metrics to be able to help me get there and a bit of best practice, but I'm really up for it. And then I guess the final thing that I would reflect on is you are seeing more firms who want to just think again about how they operate. And people will be working with business in the community. We've seen a big increase in, for example, companies trying to be B Corps, set themselves up as B Corps, brilliant movement. And then within an own movement that we're involved in, I'm sure Amanda might be aware of, the Good Business Charter. So we work with the FSB, the TUC, and Julian Richer, who I would encourage anyone to spend some time listening to Julian. He's a brilliant entrepreneur and a great advocate for responsible business. And working with those organisations, we've set up a charter. It's quite simple, but actually parts of it are really challenging. It's around things like tax transparency and prompt payments and employee engagement. And it sets a pretty high ceiling. And I think what we've seen is a genuine desire for firms across the spectrum, small, medium, large, to really want to get stuck in with this agenda in any way they can. And I think the kind of desire for firms to sign up to that charter is a really good indication of where the business community is. They are just saying, actually, we think we can do more. We can build better. We need to think a little bit differently. And I find that hugely encouraging, I've got to say.
I absolutely agree with you, and it made me smile because I've been in discussions with Julian all last week and was in dialogue with him, yesterday evening. And you're right, because when you look at things like, the Good Business Charter, when you look at responsible business, when we look at the different things that suddenly there's been a real step changing, a real shift. COVID has disrupted many things, but it's also enhanced different ways that we think about the way that we do business, and also how we collectively work together in terms of collaboration and partnerships. I want to move on because the points that you've both raised are central to how we work together, i.e. this isn't just the job of business leaders, it's the job of our communities. It's the job of the next generation. It's the job of the academic community. But it's the glue that brings us together to tackle some of these big global issues, but also what I call everyday issues. So Mark, let me come to you first. Often there is a criticism and a challenge to academia that we produce great research, but actually nobody can do anything with it. So we produce research and we say the same things time and time again, and business say, help us understand, translate this, the knowledge exchange, the knowledge integration. So how do you think academia and business could and should work together to kind of achieve the ambitions that we've just been talking about?
I think, first of all, I don't think we're particularly good at it. I think we need to get a heck of a lot better. We're very good at writing erudite papers which are read by very few people and aren't translated into language that can be understood easily. And we tend to do research on business rather than research with or for. So I think there needs to be a mindset amongst some people, not everybody, some people doing fantastic work already, but to actually work with to effect change and to support. And I firmly believe from the work I've been doing that we can be both doing research which is good, strong, rigorous research, well designed, but also research that is useful to organisations. And I think that's something we've got to do better. And within that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing with one of my doctoral students, Colin Hughes, where we've actually looked at virtual teams and how do we actually build trust in virtual teams. Now, we started this work before the COVID crisis, but it's pretty useful now, and I think going on into the future. And what we've been looking at is what leaders' behaviours actually demonstrate to the people in their teams that they are trustworthy. So how do they do that? And then also, how do they show that they do trust their members in the work they're doing? Now, thinking what Amanda was talking about earlier about how do we evaluate how our organisations are doing in employee satisfaction surveys, those are the sorts of things we should be asking leaders and employees if we're trying to build back better and businesses in a new world. And so I think we can actually start to use our work to design better businesses and support. We can also carry on doing the blue sky looking forward, because blue sky research brings very important, useful things which we don't even know exist at the moment. But what I think is there's a need for much clearer connections working together rather than working on. I think that's about a mindset change from university end rather than a mindset from business. And it's for us to prove that what we're doing is useful and to actually make the move to go across first, to translate our work so that it can be used in an everyday environment rather than something which looks esoteric, even if the ideas underneath have a great deal of practical use. So I'd sort of like to go back on that, Kieran, to go right back to the 1940s, where a guy called Kurt Lewin said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And what we've got to do is to show why our good theories are practical.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really nice quote to kind of move on. Amanda, I know that you've been utilising the research from the Lloyd's Centre for Responsible Business, and you've been working in partnership. Tell us a little bit about why that partnership works so effectively and what you've learned from that in the process, in the context of ensuring that we're utilising that knowledge and putting it to best effect.
Oh, thank you. And I have to say, we have been thrilled with the work. Well, I mean, I in my mind's eye, being able to have a sense of the responsible business health of the nation and being able to measure that over time was what the tracker was designed to do. But you do it by, it's one company at a time, and not wishing to sound cliched, one act at a time in a way within that. So, aggregated data is fine, but it literally, to Mark's point, it literally has to be, leadership being trusted because they did X. So I think we were clear about at the start, and we agreed our joint objectives. It's the classic stuff, isn't it? You agree your joint objectives together. No one party goes into this feeling they're better or worse, or they have a different objective. And together, we, the sort of academic ballast, if you like, challenged us, made sure that we weren't being too superficial, because I think that's the thing in business. Our default is, I want it to be simple, because we know simplicity is powerful, but as the phrase goes, it should only be as simple as it needs. I mean, it should be as simple, but as it needs to be. And I think sometimes, quite rightly, academics go, but there's no causality, or you've been overly simplistic. So that happened at the very beginning. And then we've worked through, and then when we get the findings, we do the research in cohorts. So companies, I think now we've shifted it. It used to be annually, and now it's 3 times a year. So they then challenge the findings that we're getting to make sure that when we have a view, an aggregated view, it's a robust one, and we're not making inference that we shouldn't be doing. So, I mean, frankly, simply put, it's just been a great partnership, because we've worked clearly together with shared objectives, and everyone thought they were equal by definition in that partnership.
Thank you. Both you and Mark have pointed, really clearly about partnerships that are based on trust, and you're both working to an agenda of change, but you're also kind of learning along the way. We talked a lot about what works. And I think if I was in the audience now, I'd say, but I want the backstory. I want to hear about the challenges. I want to hear about what you've learned from what doesn't work when we're trying to implement responsible business. And not as a negative, but a richness of learning comes from what we don't get right. And COVID-19 again has shown us our capacity to share what works, but also what doesn't work, and how we learn from that. So let me come to you, John. This is an important agenda. We've seen the passion and the commitment from each of your organisations and beyond about what you're doing to drive it forward. What have you learned from what doesn't work? And if you could maybe share 1 or 2 examples, because I think that's kind of really important. We don't always get everything right, and it's not about getting everything right, surely. It's about what we learn from that in order to build back better.
It's a really good question, Kieran. So listen, my starter reflection would be that whenever I talk to businesses about this, there are almost 3 buckets of them. So there are those who are leaders, and they'll be the ones that are really plugged into this. They'll be working with Amanda. They'll be the ones on the phone to me. They'll be the ones on the phone to Julian. Those guys are well set. There are those on a journey who are thinking, actually, this is something I really want to do, but I don't know where to start. And so they're just looking for a bit of guidance, a bit of focus, a bit of best practice. And then I've got to say, I do think we've got quite a long tail of the starters, the firms that right now are probably just kind of really focused on viability, business viability, because of where they are. If you ask them, would they be interested? They'd say yes, but they'd give you 4 or 5 reasons for why it's going to be really difficult for them. That's the group that we've got to really focus on. If I think about the kind of challenges that I've seen over kind of 6 years sort of working on this at the CBI, I'd start with Amanda's first point, which is you put 10 people in a room about responsible business, you'll get 10 different definitions. You'll get people who talk about responsible business, business with a purpose. You'll get some people that will probably default back to old-fashioned CSR, which it just isn't. But you will get loads of different variations. So I do think, to Amanda's point, and we actually use this previously as a kind of frame in the CBI, that sort of people, planet, place. You need something to kind of group people around so that they can all get on board with a definition. I think there is still a challenge, and I've seen it in some of the work that we've done at the CBI, to get people out of the mindset that this is a big corporate London-centered issue. It's not. This matters for businesses every single part of the country. But I do worry sometimes if you go and you talk to businesses, they say, well, isn't this something that is more kind of reputational thing for the big banks and the big data companies? And so I think we've got to really think about how we can deal with that. And then I think the final challenge, Kieran, is what we at the CBI call the Monday morning test. So if I am a CEO of a mid-sized manufacturer in the West Mids, what is it you're asking me to do? What's my one takeaway? And if I'm really honest, I'm not sure we've necessarily cracked all of that, but I think there are a few things that we can do. I think first of all, we can give business the tools and the confidence to tell their story better, to actually reflect on where they are, what they're doing well, and have confidence to be able to enter this field. I think secondly, we can highlight some of the many tools that are available to people to sort of see where they are. So our kind of starting point is you need to work out your starting point. You might think you're on a journey, you might be a starter. You might think you're a starter, you could be on a journey. So actually just a bit of guidance for firms so that they can have the confidence to start to plan. And then I think the final thing, Kieran, is at the CBI, we've got a real job to do because of where the economy is now, because where firms are now, to almost allow them to lift their heads, to give a bit of inspiration so that firms can think, I don't just need to focus on survival, on crisis mode, to give them something to really be engaged with. And we're just embarking on a piece of work which is going to be our kind of economic vision for 2030. What kind of economy do we want to build? Competitive, dynamic, inclusive. That kind of frame works really well for responsible business at the heart of it. So if we can give firms across the economy a kind of aspiration, a goal for why this might matter, I think it will help them to lift their heads so that they can look just a little bit further ahead than where they are now, which I should say is very difficult for some.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. I think that's really helpful and really important, because I know that, our audience will always want to kind of say, we know what works, but how do we do things? Mark, let me come to you next.
I think what John's saying is absolutely spot on, but for me, the work we've been doing has shown that it works when it's a conscious decision, with conscious actions going with it, which are thought through and shared and explained broadly, and then building on what Amanda was saying earlier, it is monitored, and it's almost at the simplistic level of saying, we said we were going to do, we've done this, here's what we've done, here's how you feel about it, here's what we're going to do next. So there's a very strong openness to communication to back this up, and there's a real ownership and a developing ownership throughout, rather than it just being one or two heroes or heroines taking the lead. And so it's about ownership, conscious decisions and actions which all feed together, and that communication and monitoring of what's going on. And without that, it's very difficult to do, because you have a few people doing something and you think, well, has anything really changed? It's about a belief in actually making it happen and showing it's happened.
Great, thank you, Mark. This is such an important area, and I could talk to you all day about it, and I'm really kind of conscious we're running out of time. So I'd like us, for each of you, just to finish off with a question and a challenge that I'm going to pose, and your response to it. The theme of today's discussion has been around disruption, responsible business, disruption as a process for good. What's the one message that you would give your younger self out of what you've learned around disruption for good? And I'm happy for you to start wherever you like on this one.
I can have a go. So the thing that I would say to my younger self is you should never regret going for an opportunity. And I think that implies just personal, but also for for a business actually. If you sense there is an opportunity, you lose nothing from going for it. It's the opportunities missed that you will regret, not necessarily the ones that you have taken. And so I always kind of try and think of the need to be optimistic. And I think disruption should be viewed in that manner. It's so often framed as something that is negative, and actually disruption is inherently positive when embraced properly.
Thank you. That's great, John. Thank you. Mark?
I'll come back. I'm going to come back to people because I think the last year has actually shown us amazing things about people in the workplace and outside. I mean, just viewing so much has been phenomenal on this. I would say that people matter, and trust people and believe in them to do good. And most of the time, you will be not disappointed, but enthralled by how much more they do than you ever expected, and how they take things in new and better ways. And we've seen this coming through in simplistic ways in people home working with COVID. That has been an amazing experiment in society, and it's actually produced high quality work, people being able to be much more autonomous and deliver beyond where they were expected to be. It's proved jobs that were thought only to be able to be done in workplaces to be able to be done at home. But at the same time, it's also brought up new challenges of those parts which are part of what make us human, and the need to communicate on a face-to-face basis, which we've still got to address. But people will develop those solutions, and if we trust them to and give them the space to do so.
Really good.
Thank you. Amanda?
Thank you. Gosh, I love the question, but I don't think I'll do it justice, but I'll have a go. Funnily enough, I want to use that phrase in the service of, actually, because I sometimes say to people, and I've sort of felt this when I think about the various jobs I've had over the years, which is, if you're in the service of something that is clearly purposeful and is going to make a difference, the level of disruption that you think you can tolerate and your confidence to deal with it is so much greater.
Yes.
Because you're almost outside of your body. Sounds a bit strange, because you're in the service of that purpose. So it's much easier to challenge it, to say things in a weird sort of way. I don't even think you're emotional, because you're so clear about what you're challenging. It's just such a productive place to be. And so I think I probably would say to my younger self, if you're struggling with something and you feel things need to move faster, define what you're in the service of and be really clear about that. Because once you've done that, it is so much easier to push forward where you need to see that change.
Colleagues, thank you so much. It's been a really thought-provoking, insightful debate and presentation from all of you. But most of all, you bring an opportunity to make a difference. And the three things that I want to kind of conclude from the presentation around disruption for good, around responsible business, is passion. All three of you have spoken, with real passion about the process of disruption as a mechanism for enhancement. We've talked about purpose and purposefulness, in order to be able to kind of make the change, learn from the change, but also not to be fearful of kind of owning up to what doesn't work. And the other one is around persistence, because each of you has talked so eloquently that this work isn't easy. But then if we want to bring about change, nothing is easy. And so for me, building back better, building back responsibly requires passion, it requires purposefulness, and it requires persistence. Thank you so much for your really thoughtful insights, and I look forward to working with you all again in the future. Thank you.